Good morning, conference. It's my privilege and honour to be moderating our maiden or opening talk. And I think this is going to be not just an appropriate opening talk, but also I think a very exciting one and an extremely interesting one. It's said that there are only two inescapable truths, death and taxes. That's not strictly true. There are actually three: death, taxes, and Chelsea never win penalty shootouts. But it seems to me that we are here addressing at least two of those truths. Are we engaged in a battle against the truth? We are here dedicated to the task of eliminating taxes. And our first speaker, Aubrey is an enthusiast for, proponent of, and expert on the process of the defeat of ageing. Two immutable truths are now in danger in this room. How wonderful, how exciting. Aubrey de Grey, it is not an exaggeration to say, is certainly in his field something approaching a superstar, and I do not use that word lightly. He is a well-renowned and very much sought-after speaker on the international circuit on matters of technology and the future. He speaks in North America, Europe, all over the world, and I believe that he was recently got star billing on a BBC special about the future. So this is a man who is, we are very, very privileged and fortunate to have him with us here today. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, please be upstanding and welcoming, don't upstand, Mr. Aubrey de Grey.
So thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you all for coming. And I hope I'll be able to start this conference with something reasonably entertaining. I'm particularly happy to be speaking to a Libertarian group because Libertarians are very much overrepresented in the life extension movement. There are really three groups that I find are particularly in favour, sort of even before I start trying to persuade them, of the desirability of defeating ageing. There's Libertarians, there's IT professionals, and there's Canadians, for whatever reason. But anyway, so yeah, I mean, I think the death and taxes thing is actually probably quite a bit to do with that, really. You know, I think Libertarians are not scared of tackling hard problems, so to speak. So I'm going to try and tell you a little bit today about what I'm doing. Obviously, I've only got an hour or less, and so there's going to be plenty that I don't have time to say. I want to apologise first of all for the fact that I will have to skip out at 11:30 at the end of the coffee break, but I'll be here obviously throughout the coffee break, so there'll be plenty of time for questions. And also, I'm very, very good with email. Anyone who wants to email me whenever you like, ask me questions, give me a hard time, absolutely no problem. Right, I'll start here. This is another thing that you can do if you want more elaboration. This came out about a year ago, officially only published in the US, so it's easiest to get it on the internet. Actually, the paperback edition that was officially published like 10 days ago, and I actually recommend that you get that one because it has an additional chapter in it that is essentially an update on what's happened in the intervening year in the various scientific areas that the book covers. This is definitely a book for a general audience. It's not just for biologists. On the other hand, it doesn't cut any corners. It's pretty detailed. So it's in some to be perfectly honest, I suppose it's fairly heavy going, but any educated non-scientist should be able to understand pretty much all of it, as long as you're willing to take your time and read things a little bit. So I hope you will be able to get hold of that. All right, so to get going. Now, the defeat of ageing is a technological problem, and any technological problem, really, the way to solve it is, first of all, to define what the problem is in a sufficiently appropriate, sufficiently concrete term. So this is the appropriate definition of the problem in this case. What is actually ageing? Well, we know that it's, in some sense, a side effect of being alive in the first place, right? It's sort of the accumulation of problems that eventually kill us. But it's useful to go a little bit further than that in describing what the problem is. Specifically, it's useful to define this term here, damage. And I want you to pay close attention to this slide because this is the way that I'm going to be using the word damage in this talk. And it underpins a lot of what I want to say. So metabolism is just a word that encompasses all of the molecular and cellular and biological processes that go on in our bodies all the time and keep us alive. Oh, incidentally, I do want to say, since I don't have a microphone, if anyone at the back can't hear me too well, then just shout and tell me to speak up. If I start mumbling, then just make sure I stop. So metabolism is basically being alive. Pathology is the word I'm going to use for the things that go wrong with us late in life, including all of the diseases of old age, like atherosclerosis and Alzheimer's and most cancers and so on, but also including the things that we don't specifically term diseases, things like loss of muscle mass and gain of fat and decline of immune function, things like that. Okay, what's this damage then? Well, the key point here is the two words in pink. Damage is the word I'm going to use for the immediate side effects of metabolism. The things that metabolism causes ongoingly throughout life, even starting before we're born, and that accumulate throughout life. And that eventually, when they get abundant enough, start to cause things to go wrong. They start to effectively get in the way of metabolism. That's what I'm going to use the word damage to mean here. And eventually I'm going to get on and tell you what I mean by that in strict biological terms, but I've got quite a lot to say before then in order to explain why this concept of damage is so important, the concept of intermediate between being alive and being dead. Here's the first step of that. How would we, in principle, actually go about intervening in the aging process, postponing the age at which the pathologies actually emerge? So I've got metabolism causing damage causing pathology here. Classically, there are two ways of going about that, two paradigms, if you like. One of them I'm going to call the geriatrics approach. And the geriatrics approach basically says, let's try and slow down the rate at which damage translates into pathology. That's what this flat-headed arrow means, by the way. That's, for those of you who are biologists, you'll know that this is a notation that comes from the genetics literature. It basically means inhibits. It means slows down this thing. Okay, so what does that mean in practice? Well, basically what it means is you identify the various things that are going wrong at an early stage in that process and try to slow down the progression of the pathology. Slow down the rate at which it gets worse and worse, and thereby postpone the age at which it gets to be seriously life-threatening. And that's a nice idea in principle. Obviously, it does actually have the desired effect up to a point, but of course there's a bit of a problem with it. Pathology is awfully complicated, there's lots and lots of nasty things that go wrong with us during aging, and the precursors of the pathology, this damage that I'm talking about, is continuing to accumulate as the person gets older. So the problem for the geriatrician is getting progressively harder in any given individual. Ultimately, that's a really bad, intrinsic shortcoming of the geriatrics approach. What it means is that the geriatrics approach is better than nothing, but not very much better, and it never will be much better than nothing. There is no way that the geriatrics approach, even in principle, can be anything other than a short-term solution to the problem of aging. Okay, so gerontologists know this. Gerontologists are people who study the basic biology of aging. They try and figure out really what's going on with the process that turns metabolism into damage in the first place. And they'd like to actually fix that. They'd like to clean up metabolism and stop it from actually laying down these various types of damage as fast as it's naturally laid down, and thereby, of course, have the same effect, postpone the age at which pathology starts to emerge and starts to get problematic. And that sounds pretty good, doesn't it? I mean, after all, prevention is better than cure in most things, and it sounds there probably would be here as well. And it is, in principle. But there's a problem with the gerontology approach too, which is that it involves manipulating and generally, improving on this thing over here that evolution has created, metabolism. And that turns out to be rather hard simply because we don't understand metabolism very well. In fact, that's the understatement of the century. Any biologist will agree with me on this, that we know a hell of a lot more about our biology, about how we work, than we did 20, 30, 50 years ago. But the amount that we don't know is vastly more, even completely ignoring all the stuff that we don't even know that we don't know. Right? So basically, it's a fine idea in principle, but at the moment, its time has just not come. And that's basically why most gerontologists are pretty pessimistic about our prospects for doing anything serious about aging anytime soon. Effectively, it comes down to this. Now, this is the stuff that you don't need to be a biologist to know, all of the things that go wrong with us during aging, and of course this is only a very partial list. They exacerbate each other, it's all completely chaotic and miserable and horrible. This is a big problem with the geriatrics approach. This is the problem with the gerontology approach. This is a simplified representation of a small subset of what we know about how the cell works, and as I say, it's completely dwarfed by the amount that we don't know. Now, a few years ago, some colleagues of mine in the US decided that it was important to try to get this message across to people. And so they wrote an article in Scientific American. This is the cover of the issue in question. And it was obviously for a general audience. They were trying to get this thing across, and they thought, well, the way to do it will be tongue-in-cheek, to be a bit humorous. So what they did was they wrote this article identifying a variety of design improvements that the human body could have that would allow metabolism to lay down damage more slowly than it currently does, and thereby allow the human body to last longer. So they've got things like the knee being built the other way around, which I can't remember what their argument was, to be perfectly honest, but they seemed to come to the conclusion that it would accumulate wear and tear less quickly than it currently does. Various other things like that. And of course, as I said, the idea here was, tongue-in-cheek. It was like, this is what we would have to be built like in order to live longer, but we're not built that way, so get over it, you're going to die. That's all very well, except for the fact that actually quite a few people didn't quite realise that it was a joke. They thought that this was actually a proposal for a treatment. Anyway, so that was, fantastic, I now have a microphone working. And I have...
Hello?
Yep, that's working now.
Yes, it was.
All right, I'll pick it up. It's going to be easy if I pick it up. How's that? All right then. So that was what they wrote. But actually, this is rather useful as a way of looking at the problem because it does rather easily reveal the good news, the gap in the pessimistic argument, the problem with the pessimistic argument. Here it is. Now, of course, the human body is a machine. It's a very, very complicated machine, and we have a bit of a problem that we don't have the plans, but it's a machine. That means that the principles that we use in the rest of our lives for extending the healthy, functional lifespan of other simple man-made machines might be useful, might be relevant to the question of how we would extend the healthy, functional lifespan of this very complicated machine, the human body. So, how do we keep machines going longer? Well, your average car might last, 15 years before you junk it and get another one. This car is about 50 years old. How come? Simple answer. It's basically the answer that my colleagues summarised in Scientific American. The thing was built to last, with obviously corrosion-resistant metal and really tough tyres and all those things. And that's why this car is doing really well, even though it's like 3 times as old as your average car would be. That's fine. But there's a reason why I'm saying VW bugs up there. Anyone got any ideas?
Is it the same chassis as a VW?
Sorry?
Did it start from a VW chassis or something?
Not quite. Nice try. The reason I'm saying this is simply because there are just as many VW bugs 50 years old driving around the streets of this country as there are 50-year-old Land Rovers. And it's not because they were built to last, or because they were in some sense transformed into Land Rovers or anything like that. It's because they've got style. And that means that their owners fell in love with them so that they did a sufficient amount of maintenance on them, an exceptional amount of maintenance which had been sufficiently comprehensive to keep the thing on the road. This car was built in the same year as the one on the previous slide. What this shows us is that maintenance works. It really works. If you're doing it comprehensively enough, you can keep machines going well beyond their warranty period, in fact, perhaps even indefinitely, just by doing enough maintenance. That's all you need to do. That is the principle. Now, going back to the human body, going back to aging, how can we actually look at that principle? Well, ultimately it comes down to this. I'm going to call it the engineering approach. You could call it the repair and maintenance approach. You could also call it the rejuvenation approach. I'll come back to that. Essentially, it fits in here, intermediate between the other two. The idea here is that we try to get the best of both worlds with these other two approaches. And what that means is, rather than trying to interfere in the process by which metabolism translates into damage, or the process by which damage translates into pathology, What we're doing here is we're actually interfering with the damage itself. We're going in and actually repairing and removing those various types of damage. And that, of course, will, if we can do it, have the desired effect. It will postpone and perhaps indefinitely the age at which the damage accumulates to the level of abundance that causes the pathologies to emerge. Now, why am I making this here, this outrageous claim that the engineering approach is much, much more promising than the other two approaches in terms of achieving a large extension of human healthy lifespan? And why I think it actually could do that fairly soon in the foreseeable future? Well, simply the answer is that it avoids the shortcomings of the other two approaches. On the one hand, it's sufficiently preemptive that it doesn't have the problem that the geriatric approach has. Here what we're doing is we're interfering in the damage itself, the ongoing immediate side products and side effects of metabolism, rather than intervening further downstream. So that means that we're interfering at a point that doesn't have accumulating precursors. So the problem is not intrinsically getting harder and harder as the person gets older, the way it is for the geriatric approach. So that's good in a way. It's adopting the principle that prevention is better than cure, and just like the gerontology approach is, and therefore avoiding that problem. But also, the engineering approach avoids the problem of the gerontology approach, namely the necessity to interfere and manipulate a system that we have a very, very poor understanding of. The reason it avoids that is simply because this damage out here is not part of metabolism. Damage is initially harmless, remember, because it only becomes pathogenic after it's accumulated to a certain level of abundance. So that means that what we're doing here is we're essentially letting metabolism get on and do its normal thing and laying down these various types of damage at the rate that it naturally lays them down. And the only thing we do is we go in and fix up the damage after it's been laid down. Now the critical point of that is that we're effectively sidestepping all of our ignorance about metabolism. If we're not actually having to interfere in metabolism itself, then we don't have to understand it. All we have to do is characterize the damage and figure out ways to repair it, and then we can let metabolism stick to what it knows. That's just one reason why the engineering approach is very promising, why it seems to be a realistic way to go. It targets the weak link in the chain of events that goes from metabolism to pathology. But that's not the only reason why the engineering approach is so promising. Here's where I'm going to start to get onto some biology. The second reason why the engineering approach is so promising is that damage is actually not very complicated compared to metabolism or pathology. I've shown you how viciously complicated metabolism is and also pathology. This is damage. This is my second outrageous claim of the day. That all of the various molecular and cellular phenomena that actually qualify as damage by the definition I'm using today, these intermediates between metabolism and pathology, all of those phenomena fall into these 7 major categories. If we look down the categories, we can see these are perfectly, well-defined biological phenomena. Junk inside cell. What does that mean? It means side products of metabolism, molecules that are created in the process of doing things that the cell has to do every day, and that for whatever reason the cell doesn't know how to deal with. So those various molecules accumulate in the cell, and eventually they go in the way, very much in the same way that your own garbage gets in the way if you don't take it out of the house for a month. Going down the list, you can see the sort of thing. Too few cells, for example, that's just cells dying and not being naturally automatically replaced by the division and differentiation of other cells. So you get the idea, these sorts of things. And it's a pretty comprehensive list. Now, I want to actually stop there for a moment and tell you why I think it's comprehensive. And there are 2 ways to answer that question. One is from the basis of biology. We can say, well, first of all, damage can only accumulate in long-lived structures. What do I mean by long-lived structures? Well, if you take a protein, for example, that's created in a cell, and it's got some job to do, and it does the job for a little while, and then it gets damaged, it gets oxidized or something, gets harmed by free radicals, whatever, then there are processes in the cell that will break that protein down, and the undamaged amino acids will be reused in new proteins, and the damaged amino acids will be excreted from the cell and out in the urine, and that's that. Now that's not damage by my definition because it's not accumulating. The damage is gone after it's been excreted. Okay? So that's an example illustrating why damage can only accumulate in structures that actually carry on sitting in the body indefinitely. Things like DNA, or things like proteins that get damaged and for whatever reason are not processed by this degradation machinery. Okay. If you just bear that in mind as a biologist, you can come down to this list. You can say basically what are we made of? We're made of cells and stuff between cells, what are cells made of, and so on. So you get pretty much this list. There's a second reason why I want to give you for why I think it's very likely that this list really is comprehensive, and that second reason is not a biological one, it's more circumstantial, but it's a pretty good reason. Here it is. It's been the same list for a quarter of a century. That's pretty damn good news, because of course we've come a very long way in the past 25, 26 years in terms of our ability to analyse biological systems and to figure out what they're doing and what they're made of and so on. And you would think that if there were 8th and 9th categories that we needed to include in this list, then we'd be coming across them at a respectively regular rate, and we are. But that's pretty good news. But that's not the best news. The best news is not simply that we can characterise the problem so well, the best news is that we have a fair idea how to solve these problems. And of course this is what you really wanted to know. I think that within the next 25 or 30 years, we have at least a 50-50 chance of developing all of these various solutions to these various problems on the left to a degree of efficacy that will give us this sort of additional lifespan, about 30 extra years. And I call that threshold, that milestone, robust human rejuvenation. A big thing that I want to make sure that you keep in mind all the time is that these will be therapies that are not applied to like infants or to the parents of people by messing with their genes or anything like that. This will be therapies applied to the people who are already in middle age. And of course that makes sense if you remember that we're talking about an engineering approach, a repair and maintenance approach, just in the same way that you don't take a brand new car into the garage the day after you bought it because there's nothing to repair yet. Similarly, the human body will only need these therapies when it's become old enough to have a substantial accumulation of these various types of damage, so that there's actually something for the rejuvenation therapy to do. Okay. Now, on the right here, obviously what I've done is I've simply given a list of the names of the promising therapies that we're looking at. But the amount that I actually have to say about these various therapies is very substantial. In the book that I've written, there's an entire chapter on each of these things. And that's very good news. That's something that you should be really happy about. Because, of course, if you think about the process of developing a solution to some particular technological problem, and then the process of identifying how long the implementation of that solution is likely to take, then the amount of detail that you have in your plan is a very important feature. If you have a sketch of a plan, but there are big bad holes in it, then you don't know how long it's going to be before you fix those holes, before you figure out really what to do. Your time frame estimates will be exceptionally speculative. But if your plan is already pretty detailed, and there are maybe gaps in it, but the gaps are all really small, then you can be correspondingly more confident of your estimates of how long it's going to take. So that's why I feel able to stand up here and give you an actual time frame estimate that I just did of 25 or 30 years. I do want to emphasize that it's still pretty speculative. I'm only saying that we have a 50-50 chance of getting there in that sort of time, and I think realistically we have at least a 10% chance of not getting there in 100 years if we just happen to hit a lot of problems that we haven't yet encountered. But 50-50 is quite good enough to be worth fighting for in my view. Alright, so that's most of what I wanted to say about the biology. Of course, I'm absolutely happy to answer as many questions as you like about this, because the biology is what I actually do. You know, that's what I'm actually a professional at. I'm only a recreational public speaker. But I'm going to go on now and talk a little bit more about the reason why the title of my talk is not just hyperbole. In other words, why I really am talking about defeating aging rather than, quote, just, unquote, giving the middle-aged 30 years of extra healthy life. Because they are very different things, let's face it. If we defeat aging, then we're going to be able to live a lot more than 30 extra years. Well, the ultimate reason why the prospect is so much better than just 30 years is here. The third reason why the engineering approach is so extraordinarily promising. Namely, that the engineering approach buys time. Repairing damage buys time. It gives us chances to figure out what to do next. What do I mean by that? Well, the best way I can explain it is using this diagram, which is extremely schematic. You shouldn't try to draw any conclusions from this in terms of numbers, at least the numbers I mentioned. But I think it will get the idea across to you, conceptually. So what I have here on this red line is that's illustrating aging as it is today, in the absence of the rejuvenation therapies I'm talking about. And I'm introducing this new word here, reserve, on the y-axis, but that's not a new concept. Reserve is simply the inverse of damage. You can think of reserve as the amount of additional damage that someone is in a position to be able to accumulate before they start getting pathologies emerging. Okay, so it's just the inverse of damage. And what I have here is that aging happens. You start off at age 0 with plenty of reserve, not much damage. Damage accumulates, reserve is gradually depleted. Eventually you hit this dotted line here, which I'm calling the frailty threshold. That's the point where pathologies start to happen. Okay? So this is normal aging, understand? Right then, supposing we develop some of these rejuvenation therapies, good enough to achieve what we call robust human rejuvenation. Okay, so I'm going to depict that by this pink line. We're going to start here, someone in middle age, they've got quite a lot of damage already, but they're not frail yet. They haven't got diseases of aging in any sort of overt way. And the therapy works fairly well. It fixes maybe half the damage. It's got to fix half of each of the various categories of damage. You can't just fix half the categories, that won't do it at all. But it'll fix basically half the damage. Within each category there will be easier things to fix and harder things to fix, and this fixes the easy ones. Okay? So more or less instantaneously the individual is rejuvenated from biologically 60, and of course chronologically 60 or so, to chronologically 60 but biologically let's say 30 or 40. Alright? Now, because we are not interfering in metabolism itself, not interfering in the rate at which metabolism creates damage, that means that after that, damage is going to accumulate at the rate that it ever did. So that's why this line has the same slope as the red line. Okay? But, of course, we can apply the therapy a second time. So sometime later we'll be doing this, and then we can do it again and again. Pretty good. Not enough. Because, as you see, we have this problem of diminishing returns. As time goes on, the therapies are less and less effective, and we have to apply them more and more often, and eventually the person gets to hit the frailty threshold anyway. Why does that happen? Simply because of the damage that the therapy doesn't work on. The hard damage, the difficult damage, which on its own is accumulating and eventually will accumulate to a sufficient level that it will tip the person over the frailty threshold, however thoroughly the easy damage is being eliminated. Now, if you and I were mice, okay, then that would be the end of my story. Because the x-axis here, on which I have carefully put no numbers, would go like, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, and that would be that. But we're not mice, of course, so the time frame here is maybe 25 or 30 times longer, and that means that the interval between the first and second applications of these hypothetical rejuvenation therapies might be as much as, let's say, 20 years. Now, 20 years is one hell of a long time in technology, in all technology, including biomedical technology. So that means that actually the big line here is not a realistic prediction of what would actually happen when these therapies are applied. What's realistic is that the second time that the therapies are applied to a given individual, okay, that they will not be the same therapies anymore. They will, of course, be good enough to remove the various types of damage that they removed previously, 20 years previously, but additionally, these therapies will be able to remove some proportion, let's say, for illustration, again, half, okay, some proportion of the damage that the therapies could not previously remove 20 years ago. And that's being depicted by this orange line here. We've got the orange line going up to this far. Now, of course, the key point is that our hero who's getting these therapies will not only be more thoroughly rejuvenated like this than they would be if they had simply received the original 20-year-old therapies, they'll actually be more thoroughly rejuvenated than they were 20 years previously when they were 20 years younger chronologically. So the person will be biologically younger here than they were the first time round. And of course, as you can see, that iterates like this, and we just don't get a diminishing returns problem. The therapies do not have to be applied progressively more often, and the person continues to stay in the long term well away from the frailty threshold, and with essentially zero risk of dying from age-related causes. So this is the scenario that I think is realistic, and of course, as you can see, that means that we do get very substantially more than 30 years of extra life. In fact, we get an indefinite amount of extra life, because the only things that are going to be killing people in this scenario are things that do not have to do with their age. Things like being hit by trucks or asteroids or whatever. And all that we need to do to make that happen is to carry on improving the technologies, improving the degree of comprehensiveness of the therapies. The therapies are never perfect in this scenario. They never fix everything. But the functional consequence of the therapies is exactly equivalent to the situation in which we did have absolutely, totally, 100% perfect comprehensive therapies. That's the concept. Now, of course, there's a cut between these two. There's a necessary rate of progress that will just make the line, the trajectory of the person's health go upwards in the long term rather than downwards. And I've given a name to that necessary rate of improvement of the technologies, of the therapies. I've called it longevity escape velocity. If we write it down in words, it looks like a bit of a mouthful. The rate at which these rejuvenation therapies need to be improved following the achievement of that initial breakthrough of getting maybe 30 extra years of healthy life, okay, following the achievement of robust human rejuvenation, in order to outrun the problem, to outpace the accumulation of the types of damage that the therapies cannot yet repair. Sounds like a bit of a mouthful, but as you've seen on the previous slide, it's really quite a simple concept. Now, why am I so optimistic that we are going to be able to achieve and maintain longevity escape velocity? Well, ultimately, I'm optimistic because we have a lot of data to look at that tells us that it's possible. And that data is not biological data, biomedical data predominantly, but some of it is. It's data that's coming from the whole of technology, the history of technology. I've just put flight up here as an illustration. Of course, it took a very long time to get this far, from the point that we decided that flying would be an interesting thing to be able to do, to the point where we actually succeeded. Even if we look at the interval that elapsed between the time when people first thought that they had a fair idea how to implement powered flight, and the point where they succeeded, that was a very long time. Leonardo da Vinci probably thought that it was only going to be a few decades before his designs were implemented, and he was wrong. And of course a number of other people in the intervening period were also wrong, but the Wright brothers were right, and there they are. And that is a feature of fundamental breakthroughs in technology. You just can't really predict how long it's going to take before they actually happen. But once they have happened, and what you're looking at is not subsequent fundamental breakthroughs, but rather incremental refinements of those breakthroughs, the situation is completely different. Incremental refinements tend to happen at a rapid and reasonably predictable rate. So I bet the Wright brothers would have been fairly surprised to learn that it was only going to be 24 years before someone was able to fly solo across the Atlantic, but this is Charles Lindbergh at the Voyage, and I bet he was probably quite surprised to find out that it was only 22 years before the first commercial jetliner, and of course only 20 years before the first supersonic airliner. Now, some of you may be thinking, well, where's my flying car then? But of course, we know the answer to that, which is that we can't be bothered. There is not the commercial pressure, whatever, those sorts of pressures that actually causes us to continue the process of improving these technologies. And that's not something that's likely to be a problem in the case of saving lives and stopping people from getting these terrible diseases of old age. So that's one reason why I think this is quite a plausible rate of progress. I can go further though. Last year, in order to, if you like, ramify this feeling, this plausible feeling, I thought it would be important to do a computer simulation of everything like this. So we started off by going back to the definition of aging in terms of damage and pathology. And we've built a computer simulation, a rather sophisticated one. And I'm not going to tell you anything about the details of the simulation because it's very boring, but I will tell you the results. This is just a sort of top-level illustration of the sort of results that the simulation produced. Now, the black line here on the left is a normal standard survival curve for a population today. I think it's actually US males in 1999, something like that. So you can see everyone's alive up here, and not many of them die early, and eventually they start dying. Maybe half of them are dead by the age of 80, and hardly any of them get out beyond 100. So that's what we already knew. Now, the dark blue line here is the trajectory that the simulation produced for a population of individuals who start to receive these rejuvenation therapies. but they don't start to receive them until the age of 80, 80, okay? So that's why the two lines are coincident until about here, because that's when the therapies kick in. And after that, they're not coincident. But they're not very far away from being coincident. As you can see, people don't actually get much benefit in terms of probability of survival. And the reason they don't is because being frail is risky, and it always will be risky. Basically, these people have already got into a state where most of them have got substantial amounts of these age-related pathologies, and fixing them up is not a simple process. So basically, these people are going to have to spend a fair amount of time, a couple of decades maybe, in a relatively frail state, and therefore a relatively vulnerable state, vulnerable to death. That's why, essentially, some of them may get 10 or 15 extra years, but not many of them do, and essentially no one gets out beyond about 120. That's the situation for people who are 80 years old when the therapies first kick in. But now, look at this line, this sort of grey blue line. That is the line of the trajectory, the survival curve of people who are just 10 years younger, 70 years old at the point that the therapies first arrive. So again, of course, initially the two lines are coincident. Probably 15% of these people are dead when the therapies first come along. And not a lot happens for a while. A lot of them still carry on dying, as you can see. But eventually things start to look up. If you're lucky enough to get out to about here, or maybe here, if you're the longest living 15% of that cohort, then up to 150 or so, your chances of dying of aging are getting pretty low because your biological age is getting pretty young. And after that, things carry on getting better. You get out to age 200 or more, and your chance of dying of old age has become essentially zero. On these graphs, we're not actually showing the risks of death from causes other than old age. And as you can see, if we go 10 years younger than that, the brown line, that's people who are 60 years old when the therapies first kick in, and nearly half of them get out to a point where they live essentially indefinitely. So this is pretty exciting, pretty good news. But the best part of this thing, the best part of this simulation, is this bit up at the top. In this particular run of the simulation, we were extraordinarily pessimistic and conservative about the rate at which these therapies would actually be improved. We were looking at the doubling of the efficacy, in other words, halving of the proportion of damage that the therapies don't yet work on. Okay? And we said, even if that is happening only once every 40-odd years, this is what we get. We get a situation in which we are easily maintaining and exceeding longevity escape velocity indefinitely. So that's pretty good news. And here's a little bit more data on that, just to reinforce, just to hammer the point home. Here's a car that's not 50 years old, it's more than 100 years old, taking part in the London Brighton Run. And, of course, this car, just like the others I showed you earlier, is just as functional as it was when it was first built. In fact, probably even slightly more functional. Now, the key point here is not simply that this car is being maintained well enough to last indefinitely. The key point is that the amount of maintenance it's getting now, yes, it's a lot of maintenance, but it's no more maintenance, it's no more sophisticated than the maintenance that the car was receiving maybe 20 or 30 years ago, when the car was only 3 or 4 times as old as it was ever designed to be. So that's, again, really, really good news. Longevity escape velocity for cars is already more or less zero, and we'll get to that same point with the human body in due course. Now, this is the sort of thing that gets me into trouble with my more politically astute, as they would say, and cowardly, as I would say, colleagues who are worried about my perhaps bringing the field into disrepute. But I feel that it's absolutely beholden upon me to not sweep this under the carpet. The fact is that those of us who think we know a little bit about how we're going to combat aging and how well we're likely to combat it, have a duty, in my view, to tell it like it is, even if the things that we conclude are politically incendiary. And this is something that I feel is a completely inescapable conclusion from the logic that I've set out to you today. The current world record lifespan is 122. A lady named Dan Carmon, who died in south of France about 10 years ago. And that means that we will not get the first 150-year-old until we succeed in developing robust human rejuvenation. And as I've told you, I have a fair idea how long that might take, but the actual time frame is pretty speculative. But once that's been done, it is essentially certain that we will maintain and exceed longevity escape velocity thereafter, which means that the first person to live to the sort of age that most of us would live if aging already didn't exist, which turned out to be about 1,000, because if you look at the time for the risks of death from causes that don't happen, that young people die of, adults, like being hit by trucks or whatever. The first person to live to that age is almost certainly less than 20 years younger than the first person to live to only 150. So that's, it's a scary, dramatic conclusion, and some people don't like to hear it, but the fact is it's inescapable as a conclusion from the very straightforward down to a step-by-step logic that I've been setting out to you. All right, I'm going to have one slide on the People Foundation. So this is the foundation that I run. It's a US registered charity, a 501c3. We do actually have a UK counterpart now called the Biogerontology Research Foundation that actually received charitable status a few months ago, and you'll be hearing plenty more about that if you're interested in due course. So now it is possible to donate in a tax-efficient manner if you're a UK citizen to this mission. But I'll talk about the People Foundation here. We have two activities. One of them is that we run a prize competition called the M Prize. There's $4.5 million in it now, and it all just comes from private individual donations. That money is given, or at least a proportion of it is given, to you if you can develop mice that beat the mouse longevity record. That's simple as that. The purpose of the prize really is PR. It's to raise the profile of longevity research in a manner that doesn't trivialise it, and that really gets the message out to people who don't really like to listen to science. And it has worked pretty well. Now, the other thing that we do is we are a simple funding body, a research funding body. People give us money and we give it out again to labs around the world leaders in all of the various technologies that are relevant to fixing all these various types of damage. We've received probably this sort of amount over the years. We've spent most of it, of course. We are still succeeding in growing pretty fast. We're probably going to be spending about $2 million this year. We'd like about 50 times that, but we're getting there. Essentially, we need to get up to this sort of level in terms of manpower, but it's going well. And the reason it's only $100 million a year, which, let's face it, is a pretty small number in terms of biomedical funding, is because initially the work needs to be done in the laboratory, not in the clinic. We need to do stuff in mice to get to really thorough, really robust proof of concept. Robust mouse rejuvenation, in other words. Taking middle-aged mice and fixing them up really well so that they live a lot longer in a healthy state. And I think that's less than 10 years away. We're not talking 25 or 30 years there anymore. So that's pretty good news. It's going well and it's not very expensive. Okay, as I said, I'm going to spend the last 7 minutes of my time just telling you a bit more about the social context of this, about why this is an important thing to do, rather than how. And I think it's important to do this. I mean, I know that this is a sympathetic audience already, and many of you don't really need to hear this, but I think it's also important to give you some more ideas than you may already have about how to get the message across to other people. Because I do find that, when people ask me, what can I do to help? If they're a scientist, it's obvious. If they're a journalist or if they're organising a conference, it's obvious what they can do. They can just get me up. But most people aren't in that position, and most people don't have $1 billion to give me. But everybody can do advocacy. Everybody can get the message out and answer the stupid questions that come along that try to make people pessimistic about whether this is a good idea. So that's why I wanted to spend a few minutes at the end on that issue. Now, some of my more frivolous critics have suggested that actually the only reason I do this is to meet hot chicks. But it's not true. The real reason I do this is on this side. I mean, what part of this do people not understand? It's pretty straightforward, really. And I do want to emphasize this really is what it's all about. The longevity benefits are definitely benefits, but they are a side benefit. The key, number one, central reason why the work that I do is important and why we all ought to be supporting it and getting it done is because aging causes suffering. Aging is very, very miserable. And the age-related diseases that we all know of, we all have friends and family and so on that are or have been in a bad way as a result of aging, with Alzheimer's disease or heart disease or cancer or whatever it might be. These are the things that I want to stop. And it just so happens that the way to stop those things really comprehensively is not to address the diseases one by one the way that 99% of the medical establishment are doing, but rather to go one step back in the chain of events and address the damage, the collective accumulating precursors of these pathologies. And if we do that, there will be this side benefit that not only will you not get these various diseases, you also will have a very low probability of dying peacefully in your sleep in the prime of health at the age of 90 or even 190, just as you didn't die in that way at the age of 20 or 30. Okay, so that's what it's all about. These are the sorts of questions that I have to contend with. You know, people actually say, but I don't want to live to 1,000. How the hell would you know whether you want to live to 1,000? I don't know whether I want to live to 100, and I don't care that I don't know. But I do care that I want to be able to have the choice of living to 100 when I'm 99, rather than having that choice gradually removed from me by my decline in health. So this is the critical point. It's all about stopping this from happening. And there will be this incidental side benefit, but the suffering is what matters. This is the sort of thing that supposedly intelligent academics say. William Hurlburt is a member of the President's Council on Bioethics in the US, and he's a very nice guy and a sincere guy, actually, and also a reasonably bright guy most of the time. And I interviewed him for the journal that I edit, the peer-reviewed academic journal Rejuvenation Research. And this is a typical quote from the interview. Basically, he says, he's not in favour of all this because he doesn't know that it's going to be a good thing. He's not convinced that the richest and most meaningful life would result from life extension. It might not play out to produce greater human happiness. This is something called the precautionary principle. And the precautionary principle has a lot going for it in a lot of ways, in some contexts. You know, it's basically fear of the unknown, and fear of the unknown is a rational thing in many cases. But in this case, we're talking about letting people die. We're talking about condemning people to an unnecessarily painful and unnecessarily early death, just because we don't know that that might not be a good thing. You know, so this is very much the precautionary principle read in tooth and claw. This is the thing that comes up a great deal. It's the number one question that comes up, overpopulation. There are various not very good answers to the question to the fear of overpopulation. The bottom answer here is the one that you really want to focus on. The fact that it's an ethical obligation to give humanity of the future the choice about this, rather than to impose our values on them. In other words, in the future, these therapies are going to exist sometime, and at that point, there will be a choice made between a high death rate, like we have now, and a low birth rate, which would be the requirement if you want to keep population constant in the context of a low death rate, because of the defeat of aging. Now, of course, there is a third alternative, a sort of temporary alternative, which is the progressive improvement using technology of our ability to pack in a higher population density without impacting quality of life, but we don't know the extent to which that's going to be possible. Ultimately, the thing that matters is the choice. We cannot tell our subsequent generations that they need to have a lot of children and therefore they need to avoid defeating aging. It's for them to choose whether they want to do that. My mother would very much like me to have kids, and I don't have kids, but she's got Aubrey. So this is the critical thing that you need to remember. And if you want a bit more detailed advice about how to answer specific questions like this or like some of the others I'm going to show you, our website, the Theatre Foundation website, has reams of well thought out answers on these questions. Here's one that happens as well. You know, let's actually, cure malaria in Africa before we worry about this. Well, why the hell shouldn't we worry about all of these things simultaneously? It's not going to be the same people working on the same things, but it's not the same type of problem. And it's also wrong to say that combating aging is not urgent just because we can't do it yet. The fact is, old people are people too. And if we really believe that, ageism is a bad thing, then we have a duty to treat old people as if they're people too, and not to deprioritise the importance of their medical care and their health just because they don't complain very much. Come on. Now, here's a really important one. It's so important that I'm going to make. I'm going to take the projection so you can actually see it. That's good? Yeah. Right. Read that carefully. People often do this. People often do this to me. I'll hammer them into the ground for a little while, and they'll say, "Yeah, that's interesting." And this is what they mean. This is universally what they mean. Never let people change the subject. That's the hardest thing in this thing, because people really, really badly don't like talking about this because they don't like thinking about it. And you've got to not let people change the subject if you really want them to actually change their minds. I call this the pro-aging trance, the suspension of normal, sense of proportion and actually as such, rationality by otherwise perfectly rational people. People really say these things. Wouldn't it be enormously boring not getting Alzheimer's? Being able to remember everything. This is one that I genuinely get quite a lot. Dictator. Hello, dictator is actually quite high on the league table of risky jobs. So really, the critical point is here. These ones are not completely stupid. They're only stupid if you use them as pretexts for not going there, for not developing these therapies. It's fine to say, yes, we need to forward that now. We need to think about how we will solve these problems. But at the moment, this is the key point. 100,000 people die every day from aging, and they also, most of them, die really horribly. Okay, that's 2/3 of all deaths worldwide. 150,000 people die each day in total. In the Western world, in the developed world, it's about 90% of all deaths are from causes that young adults essentially never die of. That's actually, on 9/11, 3,000 people died, and we were fairly pissed off. And yet, somehow, this doesn't seem, we've tricked ourselves into thinking that it's okay for people to die of aging. Now, I know why the pro-aging trance exists. It's very straightforward. It used to be a damn good idea to think this way. Because, until very recently, we knew these two things here. Aging is grim in the extreme, and there's bugger all we can do about it. Now, that being the case, one's got two choices in one's life. Either one can, spend one's miserably short life being preoccupied by the ghastly thing that's going to happen to you at the end of this, right? Or you can find some trick, some means of, psychological self-manipulation to put it out of your mind and get on with your life and make the best of it. And obviously that's the right thing to do. That's the right thing to do. Right up until this happens. The inevitability starts to look shaky. As soon as we get to that point, where we might be in striking distance of actually solving this problem, completely different game. We're in a situation where the pro-aging trance is an enormous part of the problem. And that's why everyone in this room should be going out there and trying to break the pro-aging trance, trying to snap people out of it, improve the quality of the debate about this, get the debate going, get the money flowing. That's what it's all about. So this is really my conclusion. It's as simple as this. Aging causes immense suffering and death. It can probably be defeated in the foreseeable future. That means that the sooner we start, the sooner we'll do it. It's not a case of just serendipity anymore. Sense of proportion, ethical sense of proportion, demands that we not let the deaths and the suffering of 100,000 people a day be subordinated under our various fears of the unknown. And of course that's true for the future's right to choose as well. And I thought I would just end with a quote from an icon of contemporary moral philosophy who said this in a related circumstance about a year ago. You may remember that in Florida there was a celebrated case that went to the Supreme Court of a lady who had been an assistant registered of state for a long time. Her name was Terry Schiavo, and George Bush was not in favour of that woman's life support machine being turned off. He said this. He said that in extraordinary circumstances it is wise always to err on the side of life and not to just let people die. And I submit that that's just the same in the case of developing new medical treatments to help people not die and not get sick in the first place, as it is for treatments that already exist. That's the only difference, and it's not a difference that actually counts. So I will stop there. Thank you very much.
It's hard to imagine a brighter and more compelling and more optimistic opening to this conference than the one Aubrey had just given us. Now, we don't have a lot of time, and I will take questions in the order that I see hands go up, and the first one's Ben. Second, third, fourth.
Ben Cousin, son of a pretty distinguished geriatrician in this country of the middle of last century. So I come with baggage. But it's an empiricist question I'd like to ask. I agree with all your conclusions, much more than I sort of vaguely did before I started listening. I'm very impressed with your jagged mauve line, which, to use a word you'll hate, seems very realistic, I'm very worried about your extrapolation on the basis, as far as I can see, of no evidence whatsoever from general technology, for example, the containing of gravity vis-à-vis aircraft and surface friction vis-à-vis road transport, to a much, much more complicated problem. And that's why I'm uneasy about your 1,000-year claim. I think it could be counterproductive.
Okay, so the question is it reasonable to extrapolate essentially from non-biological, non-biomedical areas of technology to medical ones?
To the extent that you do 42 years.
And I think that, and that's of course I'm saying that's a conservative, I'm actually saying that that's a very conservative impression. I think it's going to be much faster than that. It's a very good point. One could argue, well, maybe this concept of how fast technology improves really only applies to simple non-biological systems. But the thing is, it doesn't, because we can identify perfectly good examples in the biomedical world. The combating of infectious diseases is a fine example. We started off with, Jenner and Pasteur, for example. My computer seems to agree with it spontaneously, for no reason whatsoever. Jenner and Pasteur did not understand all that much about the immune system, but they still succeeded in saving one hell of a lot of lives. And we've been moving on in that general direction obviously ever since. The only reason that we haven't reached longevity, escape velocity against infectious diseases is because they kill people rather quickly. And we don't have the same logic as the apply. Rejuvenation doesn't work on infectious diseases. So that's I think an example to challenge the idea that there's any difficulty in this extrapolation. Next.
It's a very interesting talk there. I think my question perhaps links with the previous one. The examples of the technology you gave previously were developed for a commercial market. Someone was able to say there's huge amounts of people who will pay money for this. I can make huge amounts of money from this, but they're also able to make various losses, and consumers are free to reject models that they don't like and keep models that they do like. That's not the case with a lot of medical technology. Especially in this society, we live in a society where the manufacture and supply of medicine, of medical care, is taken over by the state. So I was wondering whether you think that these technologies might be developed in spite of the state, or whether that's going to affect the development progress.
It's a very good question, and it's a question that actually comes up quite a lot at the moment for those of us who are thinking about managing donations, for example. There's a lot of likelihood that a lot of this technology will be developed in the Far East, I think, where not only are the political structures different, but also the attitude to the conservatism about medical things in general and manipulation of biology is more restrained. I would say that in a society like this, where there is private healthcare as well as public healthcare, there's probably not a problem anyway, because if people want to spend money, they still can, even if people still get their medical care when they don't.
Gentleman with the grey shirt here.
My name is Alfie, and my question is not surprisingly related to obesity, and it's simply, what method of deployment do you intend to use for your therapies, and do you see the technology currently keeping pace with your claims about the time it will take for your life longevity to happen?
I do think that technology is moving forward at the sort of rate that I was expecting it to, yes. The sort of numbers I'm saying now in terms of how long things are going to take are coming down at the sort of rate that I would have expected them to within the context of the amount of money that's so far available. Certainly the last 6 or 8 years that I've been working on this, we would have got more done if someone had given me $1 billion then rather than now. But it's still gone at a respectable rate, so that's good news. In terms of dissemination, getting the stuff out there, I really don't think there's going to be a problem, even if these things are very expensive, which they probably will be initially. And the fundamental reason why is because people are going to remain healthy. At this point, here's the way I like to put it. Supposing we have just developed these therapies, and I'm the Prime Minister of the UK, and you are 65 years old, and you're about to retire, on a nice pension, right? I say to you, big guy, you can have your pension, but not the therapies. Or I'm going to give you a second option. You can have the therapies, but not the pension. You have to give me all your pension, and you have to stay in the workforce indefinitely, okay? But you get these therapies. What are you going to take?
I'll write your daily check.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry, I know there are lots of other people who have indicated they want to ask questions.
We'll be in the coffee room. So.
Unfortunately, I have an indication that we have to wind up, so you're going to have to buttonhole Aubrey privately or send him an email. All that remains for me to do is to give my heartfelt thanks, I hope on behalf of you, and I hope you'll join in with this, to Aubrey for a fascinating, stimulating and extremely interesting and very, very worthwhile opening to this conference. Thank you very much.